I'm Matt at Nexus Baseball, and this is episode 8 of the Tommy John Epidemic. This series is a YouTube read of content from the book Plague of the Gods, an outsider's perspective on baseball's Tommy John Epidemic, which is available now on Amazon. I decided to put this content on YouTube to make the material as accessible as possible. This series examines the science behind the most superhuman action the human body can produce, accelerating a baseball up to 100 miles per hour. This greater emphasis on science, technology, and medicine in baseball coincided with other new blood entering the field of baseball writing. Amateur writers and statisticians were starting to find a voice, provided by the early internet in the mid-1990s. Founding websites such as Baseball Prospectus and later the Hardball Times, independents not directly connected to professional baseball or the media were able to distribute their opinions on every aspect of the game to a wide audience of fans. A prime focus was the mystery of the cause of pitching injuries. In his key early work, Pitcher Abuse Points, a new way to measure pitcher abuse, posted on Baseball Prospectus, Rennie Jazayerli argued several important points. He presented that the pitching motion was inherently unnatural and the prime cause of injury. Furthermore, now that pitches were tracked and visualized on television, it became clear that the number of pitches thrown varied wildly from pitcher to pitcher, even given similar innings totals. He observed that some pitchers were obviously abused by teams through overuse and attempted to quantify the level of that abuse using the new pitch count data. His rationale was that it's not the number of pitches thrown, it's the number of pitches thrown tired, when mechanics fall off, muscles are sore, and the body is unable to handle the stress of each pitch as well. He described a system of pitcher abuse points. If a pitcher threw up to 100 pitches, they received 0 points. They would then accumulate 1 PAP for every 10 pitches beyond 100 to 110, then 2 points for each pitch 111 to 120, then 3 points for the next 10 and so on. A pitcher's cumulative PAP total would be a reference point against their peers and historical comparisons. Pitch velocities from radar guns also began to become more common, with commentators breathlessly recounting pitch speeds before they became available continually in graphical overlays. Radar guns had been used by trainers since the 1970s, but the technology was cumbersome and not available in a real-time fashion to those watching the game until the 1990s. By the 1990s, the enhanced strength and conditioning programs for pitchers' shoulders had drastically reduced shoulder injuries. Injuries were still occurring, including damaged UCLs, but they were moderate in number, and due to the increasing consistency of Tommy John surgery, the rates of return were increasing as well. Dr. Job's creation had become so successful that by the turn of the century, there were now several prominent surgeons performing his procedure, or their own variant. By this point, only 1 in 6 pitchers that had a UCL reconstruction performed were unable to return to professional pitching. These odds reduced the importance of the sort of biomechanical analysis ASMI and Tom House were undertaking with regard to injury prevention. Instead, it seemed that the greatest impact of their studies was on increasing balance, accuracy, and in some cases velocity. Teams, for example, were not so much interested in increasing the biomechanics of young minor leaguers as they entered their system, but instead using such scientific works as a reference point to guess at future durability and consistency. Most pitching coaches in the 1990s were still products of a much earlier era, believing that how a pitcher threw was his signature, created through their experimentation, as baseball had always done. Their velocity and arm angle at release being products primarily of their genetics as opposed to any particular training. On this basis, coaches were hesitant to implement any of House's concepts of an ideal motion, instead relying on natural selection in the minor leagues to let those who could perform rise to the top, and then relying on the new medical advances to keep them healthy. The medical community lacked, however, any sort of long-term data at this point in terms of UCL damage reoccurrence. A former Red Sox general manager was quoted as saying, "We thought elbows were solved, so we stopped thinking about them." If the manner in which pitchers delivered the ball was not being changed, that left enhanced conditioning and usage restrictions as the primary measures of injury prevention. By the early 2000s, Rennie Jazayerli's 1998 article on pitcher abuse points had been widely read in the baseball community. Although Jazayerli himself had indicated in the article that his system was a mostly arbitrary starting point for further analysis, the media seized on the term abuse, when discussing pitcher usage. When a star pitcher went down with an injury, the media, both professional and amateur, could point to the now easily accessible pitch count data included in the broadcast to determine abuse, along with the historical innings data. The arguments began to center around the dichotomy of more or less use. With the overall historical trend of baseball already favoring reduced usage to prevent injuries anyway, this was a one-sided contest, particularly when dealing with stars. No team wanted to be the one called out for abusing one of their pitchers, particularly in comparison to their peers. This is because their positions as general managers or team managers might be at stake due to the team's ability to recruit and retain top talent. Pitchers do not determine when they pitch, but will be wary of signing with a team that had a reputation of abuse. Jazzy called out several managers in his article for abuse while commending others that used their pitchers sparingly. It became an easy tool to determine if a manager was ruining his pitching staff or not, based on their usage. Likewise, the media seemed to take for granted Jazzy assumption that pitching overhand was an inherently unnatural action and must be used as sparingly as possible within the confines of the game. That sentiment continues to be echoed to the present, without any scientific basis, aside from the perceived superhuman or unnatural element to the pitching motion, unachievable by the everyman. The result was the slow evolution of pitch counts into de facto pitch limits. This process was hastened by the manner in which two stars of this period were handled by their respective teams. In the late 1990s, the Chicago Cubs' Kerry Wood was the hardest throwing starter in the majors. He underwent UCL reconstruction in 1999 after a stellar first season in 1998, which included a 20 strikeout game. Returning from Tommy John surgery, he had several successful seasons, with 2 seasons over 200 innings. After that initial success, a string of injuries occurred that some attributed to his high usage after coming back from his surgery. Rather than looking at how he pitched, the reaction was reduced innings and pitch totals by the team, lowering his usage by using him as a reliever in an attempt to keep him healthy. The Cubs' manager, Dusty Baker, was widely blamed for causing damage to the Cubs' starting pitching staff through overuse and lost his position with the team, showing the consequences of such perceived misuse. In 2010, the phenomenal ascent of Stephen Strasburg to the major leagues was looked at through the lens of what had happened to Kerry Wood. Strasburg was at the time of his debut the hardest throwing starter in the majors, frequently hitting 100 miles per hour on his fastball. His rise to the majors had been well chronicled, and he had received the largest guaranteed financial commitment to a first-round draft pick at that time. Suffering a UCL tear early in his first season after showing incredible promise, his team, the Washington Nationals, looked to avoid the perceived mistakes the Cubs had made with Kerry Wood. After his return from Tommy John surgery rehab in 2012, they attempted to utilize usage restrictions in the form of inning limits. This was to prevent him breaking down, again and thereby protecting their investment. General Manager Mike Rizzo stated that there would likely be a 160-inning cap on Strasburg for the season. Join me for episode 9 next week. Remember, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Your support makes this work possible. Also, if you want to jump ahead, please consider picking up the book on Amazon from the link in the description below. See you next week.